not the host. There we go. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Brandon Guthrie. I'm an associate professor in global health and epidemiology and one of the associate directors for the UW CFAR scientific working group on eHealth. And we have been hosting these workshops for a number of years now. Obviously, the last couple of years have been a little bit disrupted because of COVID, but it's great to be back in person. I think that workshops like this are best done in person so that we can kind of interact and try things out. But this hybrid mode, I'm hoping is also successful. So we do have a number of folks on Zoom, which is great. I may not be able to fully engage with the folks on Zoom, but I will try to answer questions. The audio in the room should come through. So if you do want to turn on your microphone wherever you are and speak up, we should also be able to hear you here in the room. And do ask questions as we go along. Chances are, if you have a question about something, plenty of other people are going to have the same question, whether they know it yet or not. So we're going to be spending some time today, spending a little bit of time sort of overall thinking about data management, designing data collection instruments, but we're going to spend most of our time talking about how to use REDCap. And REDCap is a great tool for electronic collection of research study data or programmatic data. And I'll talk a little bit about the different applications. REDCap is something that is freely available to anybody who has a UW-Net ID, which makes it really nice. REDCap itself is actually technically open source, but you do need to have a version of it hosted on a server that is maintained, and that's not a small task when it comes to running REDCap. So there are a number of different organizations that do have their own REDCap servers. If you leave the University of Washington, you may have to think about ways to get access to one of those organizations. If you're a big enough organization, you might be able to host your own version of REDCap, but it is something that you would need a sort of an IT infrastructure that would be sufficient to host that. So that is one limitation of REDCap if you are at an institution that doesn't already have access to a REDCap server. So I thought we could take a little bit of time to go around, at least among folks who are in the room here. We don't have a huge number of people, so maybe people could introduce themselves quickly and just get a sense of where you're at, like why you're here, what your interests are, and what your level of experience with REDCap is. So maybe we'll start here.
Sure. Hi everyone. My name is Janice Moore. I'm a employee here at the University of Washington. Working in PhD in South Africa. And I recently, this past year, I did a survey. Oh, thank you. So my experience with REDCap, like I developed a survey, REDCap survey last year that was shared with our faculty. I did a REDCap survey with our faculty, and yeah, it was my kind of trial run, and I'm hoping that our follow-up survey will be even better. So that's why I'm here at the workshop.
Great. Back here.
Hi everyone, my name is Yao. I'm a PhD student in global health implementation science. I've never used REDCap before, but I see it everywhere, especially on survey studies, some qualitative studies too. So I think it's useful for me to pick up this skill.
Yeah, maybe just pass it. And Danielle, you can introduce yourself if you want, or.
So quick hello, hi, I'm Danielle. I work with our CFAR admin core, and I just help coordinate these events.
Hello, everyone. I'm Priyanka, and I'm a first-year PhD student within Implementation Science, Global Health Department. REDCap is something very new that I came across last week, and we are thinking of using it in our research project. So I'm just looking forward to understanding it further. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm George Wanja, first year PhD student in implementation science. REDCap, I've been an end user, but now I want to build the surveys myself because I'm going to use them in my dissertation. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to learn how to do that.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bree Dell. I actually work with Seattle King County Public Health. So about half of our prevention division uses REDCap and our half does not yet. So we're here to build our competencies.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hillary Armstrong. I'm also from Public Health Seattle and King County. And I've also been an end user, but would like to build capacity to be able to design data systems.
Hi everyone, my name is Sheng Ruo. I'm a second year Master of Science student in epidemiology. I learned a little bit REDCap in the public health core class, but I want to learn more about it.
Hi everyone, my name is Harriet. I'm a first year PhD nursing science student. I've worked in projects that utilize REDCap, but myself have not used it. So I think this is an opportunity to learn, and I'm joining a team that is planning to develop tools in REDCap.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jerusha Nyabiage. I am a first year PhD student at the School of Nursing. I have used REDCap before and tried to develop like a tool, but I found some difficulties in trying like to make some changes, especially when you're selecting, like we want to select multiple choices. So this is an opportunity for me to be able to learn more. Thank you.
Great. This is a perfect group to have here. Folks, sounds like a lot of people have had some exposure to REDCap, but are wanting to learn more. Maybe we could get some folks online to quickly introduce yourself. I might call on people if you are able to answer. So we'll start with Pam. Do you want to just introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. How's the volume? Can you hear me okay?
I can. Let me see if I can get it to play over the speaker. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. How's this?
Good.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Pam Kohler. I'm faculty in the School of Nursing and also in Global Health. I know a fair amount of REDCap, but I'm pretty self-taught, and I know Brandon is the expert to really take us through a very clean and logical approach. So I'm excited to learn how to do this properly. And then I'll also be teaching a second year course for PhD students in nursing that's going to do some data management and REDCap. So I'm really here to make sure I know how to do all the things in the right way.
Great. And Holly.
Yeah, hi, my name is Holly Whitney. I am a program manager at Public Health Seattle King County. And I and several of my team members who are also here have used REDCap really extensively for a COVID response over the last 2 years. But again, I am also self-taught. I haven't taken any formal courses, so I'm just here to see if I'm missing anything or if I'm doing it completely wrong.
Great. And Leilani?
Hi, everyone. My name is Leilani Schwartz, and I'm also from Public Health Seattle King County. I'm an epidemiologist and have, been an end user of REDCap, utilized, uploading templates of data into an existing project, but have not designed my own project from the ground up. So I'd be interested in learning that.
Great. And Omar. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right.
Yes, it's Umar. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm also from the Seattle Public Health King County, and I use REDCap on a daily basis as end user, and I'm here to learn more about how to design projects, and I'm very excited to be here today.
Great. Elizabeth.
Hi, Elizabeth. I'm also from Seattle, King County Public Health Managers, and I've used REDCap for almost 2 years now, and just am here to learn some stuff that I might not already know.
Great. And Morgan?
Hi there, my name is Morgan. I work in the Department of Global Health as a research coordinator on a COVID and pregnancy study. I was formerly a nurse midwife. I stepped into the project and role that I'm currently in after they developed their REDCap system for following participants. And so, yeah, I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything since I'm sort of self-taught and taught by the other research coordinator on the team.
Great. And Judy, I think you're the last on my list.
Okay, thank you. Judy Machuka, counselor at Kenyatta National Hospital, Nairobi, Kenya. Yeah, I was introduced to REDCap in an IRTP advanced research training. And so I've only used it on dummy projects. So I'm keen to have more practice through this program. Thank you.
Great, welcome. Okay, so it sounds like we've got a great kind of range of experience. And so I'm going to go through a lot of the basics of REDCap. We are going to have plenty of time to practice. So if there are specific questions that you have that are maybe a little bit more advanced, I'm happy to come around and see if we can tackle those when people are working on their projects. Okay, so I'm going to turn off my video and bring up some slides here. And let's share that screen. All right, are you able to see the slides? Great, okay. So I'm not going to go through all of these slides. These are really here as a resource for you. I think that these were sent out yesterday, so you should have access to these if you don't already. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. I'm not going to go through every slide. It's really here as a resource, but I'm going to touch on some of the things that I think are relevant to get our discussion started for today. So I think it's really helpful to think about, like, why are we doing this? So what is your role? And all of us have different roles in the projects that we work on. We may be the data manager. We may be the principal investigator, where we're sort of thinking about the big picture, but not necessarily designing every individual instrument. We may be sort of the end user of the data. Regardless of where you're at, it's really important to be aware of, like, what the capabilities of the data collection platform that you're using is, what the strengths and weaknesses are. All these platforms that REDCap, as well as other platforms, have their own sort of quirks and their own characteristics. And I was talking to Janice earlier before the class started about use cases, and it's really helpful to think about what is the particular use case that you are, that you're using. And you may have different use cases for different projects. And so making sure that the platform that you're using is aligned with that. And so when I say use case, it's whatever you're using it for. So a use case might be a traditional sort of epidemiologic research design. Maybe it's a small longitudinal study where you're doing paper data collection and then you're transcribing it into a database. Great fit for something like REDCap. You may have something where you want to do computer-assisted audio self-interviews, where you're going to hand a mobile device to somebody and they are going to put some headphones on and they're going to listen and fill out the responses. Maybe not the best use case for something like REDCap. REDCap has some capabilities there, but there may be other alternatives that are a better option. You want to think, do you need to have survey components where you're going to send out surveys to users? REDCap has a survey component to it so that you can send out links to a survey. It will dump all those data right into REDCap. So as you're thinking about designing your project, think about what are the characteristics. So how big is it? Who's going to be interacting with it? Is it being done at multiple sites? Those are all things that you should kind of list out and think about sort of before you even start designing something. Think about, like, what is it that I need so that you can make sure to align the technological platform with what your needs are. So rather than sort of fighting against something, sometimes it's better to sort of switch and pivot. And I'm going to highlight throughout the workshop today some of the areas that I think REDCap really excels in. And I will flag a few areas where REDCap may not be the optimal solution. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the other options. The eHealth Scientific Working Group is working on some resources for users as kind of a cheat sheet. So we're going to we're in the process of sort of outlining some generic use cases and defining what we think are the ideal characteristics across a range of things like cost and access and mobile friendly usage. and then scoring different technologies based on how well those platforms or technologies meet those use cases. And so you could look at our generic examples and you could sort of modify it for your own application. So I'm thinking we're going to spend most of our time today talking about the how of data collection, but I think it's also really helpful to think about why is good data management important? So how are we going to be using this? So maybe you're in a situation where you're doing public health surveillance and you need rapid access to the data. You can deal with a little bit of missing data. You can deal with a little bit of sort of not perfectly clean data because you're needing it fast and you're needing to make rapid decisions. If you're in a different situation where you're running a clinical trial where that timeliness is not as important, but you really need to have very accurate, very complete, precise data. So those are things that you should think about in terms of sort of designing your bigger data management and data collection structure, of which the data base and the data collection, data storage component is one piece. And thinking about who's responsible. You all are here, which makes me think that you are at least thinking about being some of the ones responsible for setting up and monitoring and implementing these packages. But you also may be supervising those people, so you don't necessarily need to know the fine nuts and bolts, but it's really helpful to know what the capabilities of these platforms are. And then especially on the research front, but also in the public health practice front, I think sometimes we lose sight of the ethical component of data management and really thinking about how confidentiality is obviously a really key component. One of the nice things about REDCap is that it is HIPAA compliant if it is set up and administered by a group like ITHS here at the University of Washington that maintains that level of security. So platforms like REDCap offer a fair amount of security and confidentiality if you use them correctly. Thinking about how do you sort of control access to these platforms. Again, REDCap, you can have pretty fine control over different user privileges. Thinking about how are you going to link personal identifiers. So I really like to avoid storing personally identified data in the database itself, if at all possible. I typically use a link log to link sort of those personal identifiers to some study ID number. In public health, that may not be as possible, and you may need to have some of those personal identifiers right in the database so that you have that contact information there. But thinking about how can you segment the databases so that only people who should have access to the identifiable components have access. Thinking about data integrity, so making sure that your data are complete and that you have that they're valid data, that they're not collected and not appropriately linked so that you can answer the questions that you want to. Thinking about being able to anonymize or delink data after some period of time, if appropriate. And if it's relevant to you, making sure that you're in communication with your institutional review board or your ethical review committee. These data systems are a part of your IRB application if that's relevant, or your oversight by sort of your public health practice sort of ethics review if that's relevant. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead here. These are all here. But I want to start, before we dive into how you design the database, I think it's really helpful to really think first about what are your scientific questions that you want to ask. So this could be in the context of research. It could be in the context of public health practice. Before you dive into the nitty-gritty of like the questions and how you're going to store the questions, take a step back and think about like, what is, at the end of the day, what do I need to know? What do I need to be able to report in my paper? What do I need to be able to put in a report? Or if I'm asked by, the head of infectious disease for the county or the state, what are they going to want to know? And how can I deliver that information as efficiently as possible? So thinking about sort of what are my exposures, sort of to speak generically and what are my outcomes? So these are oftentimes the way that we organize our thinking when we're thinking about epidemiologic problems. And when I say exposures and outcomes, these are sort of the theoretical, like these are the, you might call these latent variables. These are the causal factors that I'm actually interested in. And then think about how am I going to measure those things? So some exposures we can directly measure them. A lot of exposures we can't. You know, we can't directly measure depression. We can't directly measure a lot of behavioral components, but we can measure them through instruments or through other types of indirect measurement. Same thing with outcomes of interest. And then once we think about sort of the measurement, then it comes down to us to figure out like, what is the exact tool that we're going to use to capture that information? So I'm going to, again, skip past this. Thinking about all the different kinds of information you could collect. And talk a little bit about sort of what our sort of range of options are out there. There's lots of different options for collecting research or practice data, all the way from really simple things like Excel or EpiInfo or Access, getting a little bit more complex. We're going to spend our time mostly today talking about REDCap. The next upcoming workshop is going to focus on what's called Open Data Kit or ODK, another really good electronic tool for collecting data. And I'm going to, in the next slide here, I'm going to show a little bit of sort of the pros and cons of REDCap versus ODK for different applications. There's lots of other platforms out there. For some purposes, you may think about sort of designing from scratch a data collection system. But for most scenarios at this point, there are really good existing platforms that you can adapt rather than trying to go out and code something up yourself. So I've alluded to these two platforms. One of the places where one of the key characteristics of the version of REDCap that we're going to be talking about primarily today is that it runs on a web browser. So that means that you have to have live access to the internet, ideally through a laptop or a desktop computer. You could run the web version on a mobile device by using it in a browser, but again, you'd have to have that live internet connection. Some applications of mobile data collection, you don't want to rely on having a live internet connection. So if you are in a situation where you may not have a wireless connection, you may be out in the field where it's not a stable connection, there are capabilities both in the mobile version of REDCap as well as with ODK that allow you to collect data offline. So you have a app loaded on the mobile device, which you can collect asynchronously data in the field. And then once you have an internet connection, you can upload the data to the database, and works pretty well. These two approaches using either REDCap Mobile or ODK do have some sort of pros and cons. REDCap was not initially designed as a mobile asynchronous platform. So the REDCap Mobile is kind of tacked on to a programming base that was not really designed as a mobile application, whereas ODK was designed from the ground up as a mobile application. That means that it looks really good on a mobile device. It looks like, you know, an app should look when you try to use it. REDCap Mobile works pretty well. It's a little clunkier. I think it's the user interface on the mobile device I don't think is quite as good as ODK is. One of the real strengths of REDCap is that you take advantage of a really good, what I call project management side. So REDCap has a really nice web interface that allows you to track where the progress of your data entry is, has really graphical representations. So even as you collect that mobile data and upload it, you can see where you're at from a project standpoint. And you can track that information over time. Also, REDCap allows you to sort of build in a longitudinal structure into your data collection. That means if people are followed over time, you can collect updated data on those people, and that's tracked sort of natively within the REDCap application. ODK does not have a longitudinal component. So if you're going to collect longitudinal data with ODK, you basically have to make sure that the ID number you're using is repeated over time, but you have no access to whatever the previous entered data is. So all of the linking of those records has to happen kind of outside of the program. That's up to you to track that. And so these pros and cons do mean that you are going to have to make a choice. There is some potential to kind of combine these two. There are ways that you can potentially, with some additional programming, use ODK to collect things and then download and upload into a REDCap database. But that's a much more sophisticated level of programming that most folks are not going to want to tackle. So usually people choose one or the other. So let me pause here. Are there questions about, before we go into the nitty gritty of REDCap, are there questions about sort of when you might use REDCap, sort of what its strengths and limitations are? Yeah. Yeah.
So the project I'm working on is I've collected data from some individuals. And I'm wondering if I make some minor updates to the REDCap survey for like the second year follow-up. So like to reach people who both we have already surveyed and people who we didn't get to survey last time. Like, will the data, when people click on the link that's tied to their ID, will that still show like what they already entered? And then they just, the survey will just show like the additional questions we added.
Great. So this is the great question about sort of making updates, and to give a precise answer, I have to know a little bit more about the exact details. Yeah. But let me give a more general answer, which is yes, once you set up a REDCap database, you can update it. And now how you update it is going to sort of depend on how you're going to be using the data. So REDCap has built into it a couple of levels of where the project is. So you start out, your project starts out in what's called development mode, which means you can make changes on the fly. It doesn't, like you can make as many changes as you want, even changes that will cause data that you've already entered to be lost. So if you delete a variable or if you create something that causes it to overwrite old variables, it'll let you do that. It's good. That's great while you're developing the project. Usually you want to move it into what's called production mode before you go to start collecting real data. And at that point, all changes have to be approved by the system administrator. That goes pretty fast. Usually, if you're here in Pacific time, a couple of hours before that will get approved. If you're, in Nairobi time, then it may be the next day, just because it does take a real person that is on the clock in Seattle to do that. One of the things that they'll look for is that it's not going to harm the data that you've already collected. And so if it does, then they might come back and say, hey, this is going to cause some problems. Are you sure you really want to do that? So one thing you can do, and this is why I said it depends a little bit on what exactly you would want to do. So one way to do it would be to actually modify the form that you already have. And so then that would mean that you could have missing variables for some things. You could theoretically go back into an old form and fill in just the missing values. Another way that you can do it is just add a new form. So you can have different versions of the same form that all show up. And so there are ways that you could sort of deactivate but not delete old versions. So they would still be there, but they wouldn't be open for new data entry. You just have the new data coming in. So the exact format that you would go kind of depends on how you're going to use it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's definitely multiple workarounds.
Okay. Any other questions before we go further? Yeah. Great. So whoever has a hand raised, if you want to just ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. This is Judy. Now, if maybe I've started collecting data with one tool, for example, and I would like to change or shift to, say, REDCap, is the data transferable?
Yeah, so you can, there are ways to, through what I call the backend, programmatically, you can take existing data and import it into a REDCap database. That's a little bit more of an advanced topic. You would have to make sure that each of the variables maps correctly to the REDCap form. But there is a way to import data, and there's pretty good sort of user manuals that come along with REDCap that do lay out how you would do that data import. So it is definitely possible. Okay, so skipping forward a little bit more, let's start working with REDCap. So I want to get everybody sort of up to speed and working on a project. I gave you two different potential exercises to go through. One is sort of much more of an HIV research type exercise. The other one is much more of a public health practice type exercise that is sort of modeled after the WA Notify program here in Washington. You can choose either one of these exercises to use. They both will kind of hit the main points that I want to highlight. And so it doesn't really matter which of these you do. We'll cover the basics with either one of them. So go ahead. Has everybody had a chance to create a new REDCap project and get it approved? Is there anybody who has not been able to do that? Okay. So you're free to work in groups if you want to, or you can work on your own if you prefer. And I'm going to switch over to a live version of REDCap. Okay, is this showing up on Zoom as well?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so what you're going to want to do is you'll go to your list of projects. Yours may be shorter than my list. So this is the project that I just created from scratch. It is a completely empty project. So what you're going to want to do is first set up a couple of the main characteristics of the project. So one of the first things that you're going to need to decide, this is changeable later on, but it's easiest if you kind of set this up up front, is first of all, are you going to use the longitudinal characteristics that come along with REDCap? And by that I mean, are you going to want to be able to have multiple visits or multiple opportunities to enter data for the same person? You can have, with a non-longitudinal form, you can still have multiple forms for the same person and not have it be a longitudinal project. But with a longitudinal project, you can have multiple visits and you can use the same form at multiple visits to enter for the same person, and it will track that over time. So for both of the exercises that we set up for today, these are longitudinal projects. So what you're going to want to do is click here under Enable, where it says Use Longitudinal Data, and it should turn to green there. One that we're not going to use today, but helpful to be aware of, is where it says use surveys in this project. When REDCap talks about surveys, what they're talking about is surveys that can be sent out to actual users, not to people who can log into the system. So REDCap has two basic ways of getting data in. One is sort of as a REDCap user. This is you, the administrator, or your study personnel, or whoever, but they have to be able to log in with an institutional login. The surveys can be sent out through a web link. They can be sent out through SMS messages. And anybody who gets that link can enter data through that survey, and it can be entered into REDCap. those surveys can be combined with forms that get filled out by study personnel as well. So if you're not using that capability, you don't have to enable this, but if you wanted to do that, you would hit enable here. I'm not going to go through the survey side of things, but it's pretty straightforward if you want to learn more about that. And then the one other place that you want to think about making a decision. So REDCap, like basically any other database that you would use, needs to use some kind of a unique identifier to identify each individual person in the database. And you have two options here. Either you let REDCap assign the ID numbers automatically, and it's going to start numbering at 1 and then just go forward as you enter new records or new individuals, or you will assign ID numbers yourself. And so the decision is really up to you. You can do both. You can let REDCap sort of internally assign ID numbers, but still collect some outside ID number that REDCap doesn't really care about, but you may use it. So it's kind of up to you how you want to do that. Be aware that that ID number is useful because that is the easiest way in REDCap to find records. So if for some reason, if there's a reason why there is a logical ID number that exists, whether it's a study ID number that you assign because you're going to preprint labels, or you need to have it working across sort of lab systems and your data entry, oftentimes for those applications, we assign the ID numbers. For a cross-sectional study where you're never really going to follow up with people again, and the ID number is not all that important other than just sort of internal use in REDCap, you may just want to let REDCap do its own auto numbering. So for the exercises today, you can do whichever you want. I might recommend to not auto number, but that's up to you. If you don't auto number, the thing to remember is that the first variable on the first form in your project needs to be the ID number, whatever the unique ID identifier that you are going to assign, that has to be the first variable on the first form. All right, any questions?
Are we assuming this is anonymous?
You don't need to assume that it's anonymous. It's up to you to determine what information is collected. So as long as you don't collect user information, there won't be any identifiers in the database. There's nothing stopping you from putting names or addresses or things like that into there. So the decision to make something anonymous or not really falls on you, the user. There is an ability in REDCap to identify variables that contain identifiers. And what that does is it then has, REDCap has built into it an ability to export the data that is stripped of any identifiers. And so it doesn't give any particular protection other than the fact that you can export supposedly de-identified data sets, assuming that you correctly identify which variables contain those identifiers. Okay, so everybody up to speed up to this point? Okay. So once we've got our project set up, the next thing that we want to do is to go to our, what's called the online designer. And what you should see here, if this is a blank project, is that you will have one form that is just called Form 1. And if you click on that, you will see a very boring record, which only has one variable in it. And that variable is just the record ID number. So this is what REDCap needs to start a project. Now, remember, we told REDCap to not auto number. So I can go in. So now at this point, I have two options. I can either use this form and probably rename it to whatever I want, or I can create a new form, move it up to the first one, and then delete this one. The easiest is probably just to rename. So what I'm going to do is go to my form, and I'm going to edit that variable, and I'm gonna, rather than record ID, I'm gonna call it PTID because that's what I call all of my study ID numbers. So what shows up over here is what's gonna show up on the screen for the data entry screen. Over here is the actual variable name. This is what's gonna get stored when you export the data. And you can apply whatever your own rules for variable names are. They do need to not contain spaces. So you can use underscores if you want to make it a little bit more readable. It will allow you to include upper and lowercase letters if you choose. Again, I generally choose to not use uppercase letters just to make my life easier. So I'm going to call this PTID all lowercase, but you can call it whatever you want. There's a couple of other things here that you want to pay attention to. So the validation is, so if I go over here to the field type, that's the type of variable that this is. So a text box is used anytime you want to allow sort of just free entry of whatever. So we'll go over the other variable types in a minute. One of the nice things is that with a text box, we can force it to be a number. Okay, so if we say number, this has to be numeric. If we say integer, then it has to be an integer without decimal point. So you can choose one or the other. If I have as a rule that all of my ID numbers are integers, then I can say, I can make sure that nobody enters a character, a non-numeric character value. I can also set minimum and maximum values if I'm saying that this is a number or an integer type. And that can be helpful if you have a range of values outside of which they shouldn't be allowed to be entered. Okay. And then this little option here that says identifier, this goes back to the question that came up when I was responding to Janice's question. If this was a variable that does contain identifiable information, you can indicate that here with this identifier. So I'm going to say no, but if for some reason I was collecting people's names, I could say yes, and it would allow me then to drop that variable for any data exports. Okay, and then I'm going to save my changes here. And I'm going to go back to my list here. And so I can change the, oops, that's not right. If I want to change the name of that form, I can go over here and say rename. And I can call this, let's say, demographics, and say save. So you can rename it whatever you want. So at this point, why don't you go ahead and choose which of the two exercises you want to do, either the kind of the HIV oriented exercise or the WA Notify COVID-19 exercise. Think about how you want to organize your forms and then start to kind of create your first form. I'll give you just a couple minutes to do that. I'll come around and answer any questions. And then we'll go around and we'll talk about some of the things to think about in terms of choosing variable types and how to do that.
Hey, Brandon, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm just looking at like the categories that you have here, and what kind of decision-making process do you have for having something just be a different section on one form versus having multiple forms?
Great, that's a great question. So there's a couple of things, and some of it is personal preference. Some of it is how in practice it's going to be entered. So breaking things into different sections based on when and where it's being entered. And then the other is when it's being entered. Is it being entered at baseline or at follow-up or at multiple visits? So I like to group together, at least thematically, things that go together and then potentially break across multiple forms. So even if I have information about demographics and, let's say, sexual risk behavior characteristics that are both collected at baseline, I might break those into two different forms just so that you don't get one really long form. So logistically, it can be a little bit easier to enter that way. There's nothing that stops you from putting those all on one form. Things that, let's say you have things that are all collected at baseline, but some of it is filled out in the clinic and other things are filled out at the lab level. Ideally, you would have all of one form entered completely and then entered into the database. And if you have things coming from different sources, I like to put those on different forms. So typically I'll put my clinic information on one form and my lab information on another form. The other thing to think about is if there are things that are collected at repeated visits, and if they're always the same, those items can be reused at later visits. So you can have one form that gets used at baseline and at follow-up as long as all of the variables are the same. And so those things I would tend to put on one form. Does that answer your question, Pam?
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thanks.
Yeah.
So in this case, demographic and care treatment attributes two different forms.
Yeah, so that's a question, that's a decision for you. So that's I kind of did this intentionally. So one of the things, so thematically they're different, right? So the demographics are one thing, and then the care and treatment attitudes are another sort of thematic area. But what's one of the other notable characteristics that is different between the two, the demographics and the care and treatment? Yeah, so demographics are collected once and they don't change, and care and treatment are collected at baseline and then they're allowed to be updated at the follow-up visit. So there's two choices that you could do here. One, you could stick all the baseline things on one form, and then you can have another form that is just the follow-up questions that are these repeated care and attitudes. And that's one option. Another option would be to put the demographics on one form, and that only gets entered at baseline, and then have another form that is the care and treatment that gets repeated. That's probably the way that I would do this, but you could, that's sort of a personal preference. You have to think about how you would then combine these when you go to analyze the data. Yeah.
So does that mean if you put them in one form, it's easy for you like not to manipulate the data set when you download it to do the analysis as compared to having them in different forms?
I don't know if it would make it any harder or easier to update the data or to do any data cleaning, because in both cases you're going to need to know. The only thing that would be a little bit trickier is if you put them in, if you had the care and treatment variables on two different forms, you're going to have to do a little bit of work when it comes to merging those data together, because you're going to have variables that have different variable names but are really the same variable, and so you're going to have to think about how you're going to manage that piece. REDCap will allow you to update in REDCap to make changes regardless of how you set it up. It does allow you to do that. Generally speaking, I like to do most of my data cleaning outside of REDCap. I use Stata, but if you use R, so I do it programmatically, not in REDCap. But you could go in and edit and update things in REDCap. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me about the editing piece, because I'm also wondering if you can put them in one form and have them submit it, and then when it's time to do the follow-up, I just have them, make it edible so like you can log in and then entering additional data.
So I don't like to do that. I like to have one form entered and complete and not opened back up. So if I have a follow-up, I want a new form rather than coming back into the original form. So generally speaking, certainly for research data, that would be how I would prefer to do it. Great. Yeah.
I have a question. So is the RA who collect the data, if they can access to the background and also edit those data?
So it depends on how you set up the permissions to access this. So I believe you can have separate permissions for entering data and editing data. The tricky thing is, though, that if you have a longitudinal project, even a new form for a follow-up visit is considered editing because you've already created a record for that person. And so if you don't allow somebody to edit, they won't be able to fill in the follow-up data for them. So that is one thing that I think it's a limitation of REDCap, that you can't really prevent people from changing data that has already been entered. REDCap automatically, you can't even do anything about this. It creates a record, a history of every single change that's made. So you can go in and audit all the changes that have been made, but that's pretty tedious. You would have to sort of know that there had been something that happened to go back and figure out what it is. You can't just prevent all changes to enter data to happen. So that is something to definitely be aware of with REDCap, that you can't really prevent people from editing or changing the data. ODK is different. ODK, in fact, you really can't edit the data once it's been entered. Danielle, are you able to email Leilani the projects, the exercises?
You know what? One of my colleagues forwarded them to me, so thank you.
Okay, never mind. We're all set. All right, have people set up their first, I know you haven't completed your first form, but have you created the form, created a PTID number? We're there? Okay, let's talk a little bit about types of variables and making decisions about how you're going to structure your variables. And then I'll turn you loose again. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about kind of how you're going to design your variable types. And so we've already talked about the PTID numbers, or your unique record number. Timestamps, not so relevant in REDCap because REDCap, like I said, it creates a record of everything that happens. So you can always go back and figure out exactly when a variable or a record was created or edited and that kind of thing. So it creates those timestamps for you. Most of the time, especially if we're using this for research or analytic purposes, we're going to want to put our, we're going to want to numerically code our variables. So for categorical variables, whether they be, yes, no variables like that are binary or lots of different options, we want to have a consistent numerical coding. And so I typically use 0 for no, a 1 for yes, or 0 for absent, 1 for present. And then I have some sort of generic numerical values that I use for all the other options, like not known or not entered or choose not to answer. Sometimes those can all be collapsed into the same thing. Sometimes those different things are sort of interpretable that you may want to capture. So there's no set rules for this. I would say if your group that you're working with has some conventions, it'll make your life a lot easier to use those same conventions, because then it means when it comes to analyze things, you can use a lot of the same R code or stata code that's been used previously. We're going to want to think about what are nominal variables. So these are things that have no logical ordering. And so they can have whatever order, but you would just want to be consistent. Other ordinal variables, obviously you want to have the numerical values having sort of a logical ordering. One thing to think about is if there's any chance that you might want to slip a value in between some two categories later on, you may want to give yourself space, because if I choose that I want to have something in between less than primary education and primary, and I've coded it 1, 2, 3, and then I decide that I want to slip in something in between there, I can't go back easily and recode all of those. They're going to still be 1, 2, 3. But if I change what I call a 2, then I'm going to have a problem with all my old data. So if you think that you might slip categories in between, you could say, you could make these 1, 10, 20, 30 to give yourself space to fit values in between them. So that's just one thing to think about. Even for nominal values where there isn't a logical ordering, if I have 0 for no, 1 for yes, and 2 for not known, and if I now have let's say I want to say yes, no, maybe, and I want that maybe to be a value of 2, then now I've got a problem, because all those 2s that previously were coded as not known are now they mean maybe. So oftentimes I push all of those sort of not knowns or did not answer to much larger values. That gives me space to add in other options without kind of having to go beyond that group of numbers. That's just kind of a trick to use. I used to not even bother putting this slide in, because I thought, well, it was so obvious if something like this, you had a question like, what is your partner's HIV status, that you would set this up as a multiple choice that is sort of like a radio button that is automatically filled in. But I have ended up having to deal with data that looks like this, where people set it up as a free entry form for something that should have a set list of options. And this is a nightmare when it comes to analyze the data, because now I have to go in and clean up all of these results. So think about how you're going to use the data. And if there are a discrete set of options, and if you can predict what those are, even if there are some where you might have some things that you can't anticipate, it is much better to have an other option and then an option to fill in what that other is, than to have mess like this, where I have sort of every conceivable combination of what, positive and negative. So this is, again, thinking about two different ways of entering in these coded data. So one option is to literally you fill in the number. The other option is to use what we would call either a checkbox or a radio button, where you choose negative or positive and not this coded approach. Generally speaking, this option 2 is much preferable because it really cuts down on the potential for somebody to enter the wrong value there. The only exception maybe is if you're getting this from some other data source that is coming in as a 0 or 1, you might just have them transcribe what that value is. But for the most part, you're going to want to take advantage of that radio button variable type. And then really anticipate what is it that you need to know with a given variable that you're collecting, and 2, anticipate what are really the conceivable variations that you could get in that. And obviously, with questions like, what is the participant's gender? Thinking simplistically as, well, that's male or female, that is not going to work for most settings. And so thinking about what is it that I actually want to know? Do I want to know about gender identity, what somebody identifies in? Do I need to know whether they have an intact uterus? Do I need to know whether they have a prostate? Those are very different questions, and they need to be captured in different ways. So think carefully about what do I need to know and how am I going to ask it and collect it in both a scientifically appropriate way and in a way that is going to be sensitive and responsive to the needs of the participants that you're working with. Think about, I sort of alluded to this flexibility. So this would be an example of where I have a check all that apply variable, and I try to anticipate what all the likely options are, but I give myself an out here. I say that there may be other options, and I'm going to capture that what those are with an open-ended specify. So for the most part, hopefully I can capture all of the likely responses, but I don't lock myself into that ahead of time. I always include sort of a not known and a left blank option, unless there's really no way that somebody could not be a known answer. The reason here is that I like all of my variables to be required for data entry. And that means if somebody left it blank or they didn't answer, I want to be able to put something in at the data entry point so that I know that they didn't forget that question. But I need to have some option for somebody who didn't enter it or chose not to answer. So think about what are all the ways that you would want to be able to capture kind of the data entry process in practice. Check all that apply variables. Even though this is one question, I actually need 4 individual variables to capture this information, okay? So REDCap does this for you. So you can create, in REDCap, this is one variable, but then it creates 4 variables for you. So each of these is a yes/no option. And you have 2 basic choices in REDCap for check all that apply variables. So one is what's called the over here, the check boxes. In this drop down, you say check boxes for multiple answers. Option 2 is to use what's called a data matrix. And when you click data matrix here, you're given you enter one prompt. So this says, the matrix header says, in this case, which of the above symptoms prompted you to seek care? And then you fill in each of the options here. So fever, diarrhea, vomiting, cough. You enter the variable name that's going to be used for each of those options. And then you fill in it's not here, but the choices come down here. And with the data matrix, you can specify what the choices are. So in this case, I've said yes, no, but they can have more than just 2 options here. The matrix approach is really useful if you want to ensure that somebody says affirmatively yes or no to every option. The checkbox option is like any other checkbox you've used on a web form, where you just put a check mark next to everything that that is true. They save the variables in a little bit different way. So in REDCap, if I use the checkbox approach, it takes the stub of the variable name that I gave it, but then it just says 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So I need to know what 1, 2, 3, and 4 are. Whereas with the matrix option, because I named each of these variables, then I can give them whatever name I want to give them. But the coding is the same. The main reasons that are going to drive you to one or the other is that with the checkboxes, that tends to be easier for the user to do, especially if they're probably only going to enter 1 or 2 options. But it does mean that I'm assuming that an absence of a checkbox means that it shouldn't have been checked, not that somebody forgot to check it. Whereas with the matrix, they have to, I can make it so that they have to put something in. They have to say yes or no. And so that reduces the chance that they're going to make an error there. But that's really time consuming if you have a long list and, let's say you have 50 medications and they're only going to check 1 or 2 of them and you're forcing them to check no for everything. People are going to not want to do that at the data entry point. Questions on this? Okay. Talked about, sort of making data entry easier. So drop down lists or checkboxes or radio buttons so that you can have sort of easy entry. Drop down lists are great if you have a really long list to make it not so cumbersome. Radio buttons are good if you just have a couple of options. It makes it a little faster to check. And then checkboxes if you want to allow people to put in more than just one answer. So for things that are not mutually exclusive, you need to give that opportunity. There's some error checking that you can do. We'll spend a little bit of time. So the easiest error checking is you can enforce, for each of these variables, you can say whether it is a required variable or not, which means that you'll get an error if they don't enter some value. You can have some logic checks. So the value that is entered in one variable can be dependent upon some other variable. So you can do some checks that way. And you can set some range values for what are acceptable values. I think the last thing that I'll say here is just be thoughtful about how you name your variables. I try to keep my variable names relatively understandable so that I can look at them and have a pretty good sense of what they are. You should still have a data dictionary, but you also want them to be fairly short. So variables that are more than about 26 characters oftentimes will get truncated when you try to import them into a statistical software. So I try to keep my variable names below 26 characters. And to do that, I try to be consistent about abbreviations that I use. So YR for year, OTH for other, and just be careful, consistent. So I mentioned sort of those other options. And then if I'm going to specify what other is, then I would say other and then SP to indicate that's where I've filled in that information. Okay, I know that was kind of a lot of information, and we'll get to branching logic here in a minute. But now I wanted to start making some decisions for whichever exercise you're doing, how you're going to capture that information. Okay, so one of the first if you're using the HIV example, and this is something that I think comes up quite a bit, is things like dates. And so REDCap does have some options for handling dates. Believe it or not, to capture a date variable, you're going to want to use the field type of a text box here. So I'm going to say date of birth. And I'm going to say, just going to call it DOB. And then over here, I can use a date. So under validation, I can use a date here. And depending on where you are, will determine whether you want to do day, month, year, or month, day, year. So it's important to make sure and specify that correctly. And I'm going to say that that is required. And I'll go ahead and say save. And so this is what it looks. This is not exactly the data entry form, but this is more or less what it will look like here. So you can enter in, like this, or you can use the calendar. So you can have this today option, or you can have a calendar here that you can pull down and select a date. Okay. Now, any concerns that you would have about a variable like date of birth? Yeah. Okay, so there is logic that you can do to set a rule that it has to be before the current date. So I'm not going to get to that exact coding, but yes, it is possible to impose some rules about sort of the minimum and maximum values. Okay, what other considerations might come up with dates? Yeah.
Order, month, days.
Sorry, what was that?
That order of month and days.
Yeah, so that is a big issue, the order of month and days. It is one reason that I like that calendar option. In REDCap, when I do this not in REDCap, I actually, or even in REDCap, I actually prefer to have somebody enter the month in letters so that it is really idiot proof that there's no way that people can get them mixed up. One way to do that would be to have them have separate variables for the day, the month, and the year. And that way you just make it so they can't mix them up. That's a great option. If you choose to use a date variable though, it is not going to, there's not a way to have it show up as like JAN written out for January. I saw another hand up.
Yeah, I'm concerned that if someone is like, when we calculate that in an age that is impossible, for example, like 200 years old.
Great. So yes, you can impose some rules about sort of the minimum and the maximum value for the date of birth, and that is so that helps with that. There are plenty of places where people don't always know their exact date of birth. And we've ended up with this situation a lot of times, and you think, well, you're not even thinking, you just think, you stick that date of birth thing there, and then you have to deal with the fact of like, well, sometimes people know their the year, but they don't know the month and the day. So what do? You have a couple of options. One is to just have some rules that says, if they know the year, fill in the year. They don't know the month and the day, put the 15th of the month and put April or something like that. You just have a fixed rule, or January 1st. The other option would be to have something where if they know their exact date of birth, they enter this variable. And if they don't, then they enter what their best guess for their age is without a date variable. So let me show how you might do that. So I'm going to add a field and call it date of birth known. And this now is going to be not a text box, but I'm going to make it a multiple choice radio button. And I'm going to say, oops. So I'm going to say 0, no, and 1, yes. So this is how you code your multiple choice options. And I'm going to say that that is a required field. And then I'm going to create one more variable. And I'm going to call it estimated age. And that's going to be a text box. And that is going to be, I'm going to call it age. And that needs to be a number. And say, let's say I'm going to say the youngest is 0 and the oldest is 110. And I'm going to say that's required. Okay. So I don't want to ask everybody these, and I want to make all of these required fields. And so in order to do that, I only want the date of birth variable to show up if somebody says yes, they know their date of birth. And I only want the age variable to show up if they say no, they didn't know their date of birth. So what I'm going to do is set up some branching logic. So branching logic is the same as what we would call a skip pattern. So we use this little green two-headed arrow here. And this brings up a little dialogue. And for the most part, you can use this drag and drop logic here. So what shows up on the left-hand side are all of the variables and all of the options for all of the variables that you've created up to this point. And so what I can do is I can say, so if I'm on the date of birth variable, and I'm going to say that only shows up if DOB known yes is true, okay? And then I want estimated age only to show up if DOB known is no. So the two options you have here are all or any. So this is equivalent to the logical operators of and or. So if you want it to show up if any of the things that you put over here are true, then you would say any. And if they all need to be true, then you would say all, okay? In this case, it doesn't matter because we only have one option that's going to trigger this. All right. So we have one form partially created, and I want to just show you what that looks like. Okay, so over on the left-hand side, I have an option to add or edit records. And I can either choose an existing record, which doesn't exist, or I can create a new one. So I'm going to say, I'm going to call, you have to enter what its ID number is. So I'm just going to call it 123. And so I see here is the ID number that I just assigned. And I say, the first option that I have is, the first question is the date of birth known? I'm going to say no. And so then I enter an age. If I change my mind and I say yes, it's going to erase that value. I say okay. And now I see that the date of birth option comes up there. So the logic, the skip logic, determines what the next variable is. Now, if I say save this form, I'm going to get an error because I made that variable required. So I do get an error saying that there are missing values on the page. And it says the missing value here is the date of birth. REDCap will allow you to override that. For better or for worse, it does allow you to enter missing data for required variables, but you have to say ignore and leave the record, and it'll save it. But if I say okay, then I say I have to put that in, and I can save that form. Okay, so go ahead. I think you've got enough tools at this point to start working on the exercise. I can come around and help you out with questions that you have. And for those online, I'm going to just kind of rotate around the room here, but do speak up if you have a question.
Hey, Brandon, this is Pam. I have a question when you're ready.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I had just a question about date of birth. And if you had good suggestions for like, when is it just fine to ask age versus when do you need their actual date of birth?
Yeah,
because my experience is date of birth gets so tricky with all the issues that you've so well laid out.
So it depends on what you're using it for. And I think this is why it's really important to think about, like, what are you using the information for? If you're working with like pediatric cases, and there's a big difference between a 1-month-old and a 6-month-old, you really want that as accurate as possible. And in that case, sometimes we actually ask overlapping questions. We ask for the date of birth, and we ask for the age in, say, days or months or something like that. And if they don't match, you could even have that be an error check right in the form, or it could be something that it triggers your research assistant to go and follow up and correct that error. Because that is such an important variable. If it's an adult population and you don't really care and you're going to like categorize them in 5-year categories anyway, I think you're right. In that case, oftentimes you may get more accurate information by just asking the age rather than the date of birth. Or you may ask again. You may also. Allison Drake and I have gone back and forth on this. Sometimes in her projects, they do ask both questions because like maternal age is really important and they want to make sure that they get it as accurately as possible. So I would say start with what you're going to use it for and go with the least burdensome way of collecting it.
Awesome, thanks.
Yep. All right, we've got about 15 minutes left, and I wanted to go over a little bit of some next steps that you might want to think about. So I'm going to go to a project that I've already created. And one of the things I want to show you is if you've got a longitudinal project, how do you take advantage of what REDCap calls events? You might call them visits. So you can define what all of the events are. And so to do that, you're going to go back into your project setup area, and you're going to go over to right here where it says define my events. And you can set, this could be some kind of a trial where you have different arms that have different events. For the purposes of this, I'm just going to have one arm. And I've defined 4 events. I've got baseline, I've got visit 1, visit 2, visit 3. And you can rename those if you want. You can set up the number of days between events to take advantage of some auto scheduling that REDCap can do for you, but I'm not going to do that right now. Once you've got your events defined, then you can designate your instruments for each event. So what you'll see here, I'm going to go and edit. So as columns, now you have each of the events or visits that you just created. And as rows, you have all of the forms that you've created in your project. And you can click for a given form, you can assign it to any number of events you want. And so what that's going to do is REDCap is going to know that those are the events those are the forms that are to be filled out for each of those events. Okay, so once you've defined that, you hit save. And one of the really nice features of REDCap, we've already gone into sort of how to enter data here. But one of the other nice things is that you get this nice dashboard. And so as you enter data, what you'll see, let's go ahead and enter something new. So I'm going to enter a new record. I'm going to call it 999. And I see that person gets its own little dashboard. So I'm going to fill out the demographics here. And I'm just going to fill in all right, and now what you see is now it's gone to yellow here, and it shows up as yellow because there's a little tracking variable here that says you have control over this. So you can have your own internal process for when do you define it as entered but not verified. And if you have a verification step, then you can set it to complete. And so now you can see that I have one form filled out and all of the rest of these forms are missing and not entered yet. Okay, and then that will also show up if I go to the overall dashboard. Here's that person that I just entered. I can click on any one of these and it'll bring up that form to enter. Okay. And then the last step, kind of closing the circuit here, is exporting your data. And one of the things that I love about REDCap is that you can really easily export data. So if you go here to data exports, oh, that's not right. Oh, export data. Okay. So I click here and I can export it just as an Excel spreadsheet, and raw data exports those numerical values for any variables that are coded numerically. It'll export the numerical values. If I say labels, it's going to export the labels, not the 0, 1, 2. It'll export the text version of what that is, yes or no, or present, absent. Typically, you're going to want the raw data if you're going to bring it into a stats package. But if it's just for sort of you to view in Excel, then you might want to export the labeled data. But even better is if you're using one of these stats packages, it will export the formatted data for you. So I use Stata, so I'm going to export that. And what it does is it exports 2 different files. One file is the data file, and the other file is a Stata import file that writes all the code for importing the data, labeling it, and doing all the formatting for the variables. All you would have to do is go into that Stata file and change the file path for where to find the data file. And everything else should just run, and you can import the data and then do whatever next steps in your analysis you want to do. So I think that covers most of what I wanted to talk about today. Happy to sort of answer any other questions that folks have. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just missed the part where you showed where to find events.
Yes, to define events. So go to under project setup, and then right under your design your data collection instrument, there's this section for defining events. Are you finding? Oh, now make sure if you didn't set it up as a longitudinal project, that won't show up. All right, any questions from folks online?
I have one. I just wanted to ask about data entry. I think you mentioned the mobile app, and now that we kind of see what this looks like, what are some best practices for data entry, especially when you have people out in the field at like health facilities and things like that?
Yeah, can you say a little bit more about
like, are people going in, and this is a very like ignorant question, but are people going into your team, your research assistants, are they going in to this same interface and then just hitting like enter data? Or is there, you know, I know there's also the option to send people surveys, but if people are like not at a computer and trying to use the mobile, like how does that kind of operationalize?
Yeah, so that's kind of the part 2 of this. Well, that the next step of this would be to go into the REDCap mobile app, which is, I do have a lecture on that also that I can go through with you. But the basics of it, so there's a couple things you need to do. You do need to enable the mobile app in your project. There's a little settings in there that you need to go in and tell it that it is enabled for mobile access. There's a little bit of work that you have to do. Obviously, you have to download the mobile app on the device. And then there's a little bit of work that you need to do to sync up the device with your app. And so you scan a little QR code to get the project linked to the device. And then once you do that, then it's pretty straightforward to go and collect the data on the device. So you can collect it and then sync it up to REDCap to get your data into there. The mobile app will work with longitudinal data collection. That's where it gets a little bit clunky. I think REDCap works best if the mobile app works best if you're collecting either cross-sectional data or where you can collect longitudinal data, but you're not on the mobile device. You don't download the past records. You're sort of just collecting individual visit data. That works pretty well. I would say having the longitudinal data on the device especially as you get bigger projects, gets a little bit clunky. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thanks a lot.
Okay, and then I'm happy to go through some of the details of the mobile app with you another time if that would help.
Awesome. Thanks.
Right. Yeah.
I have a question. So does the REDCap separate the mobile user and web user? For example, like we are in the backside and
Yeah.
we are like the web user, you see it in the website. And does that separate with the mobile user who input the data?
Great. So the question is, how does the web user and the mobile user interact with each other? So they're pretty interchangeable. So you can have it set up so that you can enter data either on the web interface or on the mobile app, and they'll go into the same data set. You can download data from the server version onto individual devices that have already been loaded. That's where I say that I don't think works as well as it would be ideal to, because oftentimes, especially if you have a lot of data, it's just not able to load all those data correctly. But if you're just collecting data, as long as you have the right ID number, it'll push that into the database and it will work. It works actually really smoothly. So as soon as somebody uploads it, you'll be able to see it on the desktop version.
So can I see who input those data?
Yes. One challenge, and this may have changed. It's been a little while since I've looked at the mobile apps. One thing that is really, I think, a little bit problematic is that, at least the way that it used to be, individual mobile users all have the same username. So you actually can't, if you have a field, like a variable that is who entered the data, then you can track it, but it won't automatically, so all the mobile users will look the same. Whereas with the desktop version, everybody has to log in and it'll show up who, even if you don't create a variable, you can see who entered that record. But that with a mobile app, all the mobile users essentially are the same user.
So it means that when I export the data, I don't want to export the data I input. So I will input the data, use the website. So then can I screen that when I export those data?
You mean export it out of REDCap?
Yeah, and I don't want to export the data I input. I only want to export the data you input, for example.
Yeah, so that if you have mobile users, you would probably want to create a variable for who is it that's entering this that is independent of the system created user. And that way you could, I don't know if you can export only those records, but you could, once you export it, you could say, just show me all the records from person X.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, is it like creating a field with the name of the person collecting?
Correct. Yeah. So you could make that the first variable, after the ID number or something. Like every form could have the person entering it. If it's not a certain, if it's a research assistant, then they have to sign the form to say that it was them who was entering it. Yeah. And that could be a drop-down list with initials, and you can go in and update that drop-down list if you wanted to. Great. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh yeah, okay, so yeah, so I think this is the question is, can you create a text box? So if you have that other, if you had a checkbox or an option for other, can you then have a free entry text variable that shows up if they click other? And yes, so that's the way that I would set it up. And I actually have an example of that in this project. So all right, so here I have a variable for asking about the benefits of ART, and I have one of the options is other. So we can look here and other, I have it coded here as 7. And so then what I would do here is I would create another variable that is ART benefits other underscore SP. And that's just a free form text box. And the branching logic is such that that only shows up if they clicked. So the coding here is that this is a variable and the option here is 7, which is that was the other option. And if it's set to 1 or present. So then this other specify is only going to show up if I clicked this other option. All right, any other questions? Well, thanks everybody online. I think I'll close the Zoom now.
Thank you so much. That was awesome.
Great. Thanks everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Bye.